Lecture 3, May 14, 1963. Ladies and gentlemen, I promised you last time that we would provide our discussions here with something of a framework by linking them with Kant's treatment of moral philosophy, and I shall stick to my promise. However, in this context I should like to say a few words about method, not about method in general, but more ad homines, and by homines I mean me as much as you. In particular, I am referring to a certain difficulty that evidently makes its appearance in connection with my lectures in particular. Outwardly, this difficulty takes the form that people who attend my lectures find they are unable to take notes as they can in other lectures and hence have nothing in black and white to take home with them. I have on various occasions heard and seen that this is the case, and recently it has even found its way, barely disguised, into a novel one. I would like to dwell a little on this matter for a moment. I can understand very well that you feel the need to have something hard and fast in your hands, particularly since at the very start of your studies you will not have had much opportunity to reflect on the distinction between mere learning and learning philosophy, which according to Kant is nothing other than learning how to philosophize too. On the other hand, you have to be aware that there are some very serious and very considerable difficulties here. And you can take my word for it that the approach I have chosen is neither rhapsodic nor arbitrary, but that if I decline to proceed with firstly, secondly and thirdly, and if I fail to give you a set of definitive statements, this is bound up with the essence of what I stand for philosophically. Those of you who have taken the trouble to look at my writings beyond what you can learn in this course of lectures will have seen quickly enough why this is the case and why it cannot be otherwise. But I should like to make two further comments, or perhaps a whole series of further comments. I believe that it is good for these matters to be aired, for us to take a frank look at them, rather than letting them fester in a murky realm halfway between whispering and fascination. 3. My view is as follows. Firstly, philosophy consists in reflection on knowledge and not in the immediate transmission of information, and anyone who becomes seriously involved with philosophy, and I assume that this applies to you, has to be prepared to submit to the process of reflection, and to reflection, moreover, conceived as free, without any spoon-feeding, and cannot expect philosophy to provide the kind of solid subject matter that is normal elsewhere. This applies with particular force in the present situation in which the concept of so-called systematic philosophy has become profoundly problematic. I cannot go into the problematic nature of systematic philosophy here and now, if only because we would never get onto anything else, but I assume that you are all more or less aware of this problem, which was radically formulated as early as Nietzsche, who talks about the dishonesty of the system or the dishonesty involved in creating systems. Point 4. But at all events, in such a situation and especially when one's own thoughts are so critical of the concept of system, it would be inappropriate to clothe one's ideas in a form that in reality does no more than mimic a non-existent system. Instead, I at any rate think it the task of philosophical discourse to attempt as far as possible to express as discourse, in other words, through the form in which it is presented, something of the content it wishes to convey. It is an essential feature of philosophy that form and content cannot be separated from each other, as is supposed to be the case in the various branches of learning, although it is my view that an expert on German literature, for example, who used phrases such as roughly speaking in his texts would thereby disqualify himself as utterly as any philosopher who indulges in linguistic waffle and thinks it acceptable to talk in phrases and generalities. I have told you that I would think it contemptible were I to formulate my ideas in terms of firstly, secondly and thirdly, since this would amount merely to the pretense of a systematic treatment that is inappropriate to the subject matter. What I am trying to do instead is to lead you undaunted over the rough ground in pursuit of the ideas and reflections which in my view represent the actual movement of philosophical thought. There is, finally, one other consideration that bears on the form of philosophical lectures and indeed on lecturing in general. I am accustomed to pay very strict attention to forms, and this holds good for the form of lectures too. I would say that the lecture, which came into being in an age when printing had long since been in existence, is in a certain sense an archaic form, a point Horkheimer once demonstrated very elegantly. 5. That is to say, it has in a sense been superseded by the written form. Hence, if this form is to be retained, if people are to continue to give real lectures, this can only have a meaning if the things that are said during a lecture, and the way they are said, cannot be found in printed form, especially not in the so-called authoritative texts of philosophy. Hence I regard with contempt the idea of simply regurgitating the contents of a book, and rebel against the whole conception. It would also be very foolish, because if it were simply a matter of gaining a knowledge of some theories or other, of opinions or doctrines that have been handed down in the history of philosophy, these are matters that you could indeed learn much more easily by reading them yourselves. Reading them for yourselves would also have the advantage that you could dwell on the difficult passages, and philosophy has no shortage of those, and really sink your teeth into them. That is much better than for me to attempt to expound them here, since I would necessarily have to condense the arguments much more and you would find them rushing past you. This is one reason why I have chosen a form that some of you find so puzzling. But it is often the case that if we are baffled by the form in which something is presented, the difficulties frequently arise from the fact that we approach them with false expectations. In this instance you have come with the expectation that I shall deliver something like a system of ethics or a philosophical system, or something of the kind, and you then measure what happens against your expectation and end up feeling disappointed. There is a similar situation in modern music. Such music is misunderstood by many people simply because they expect it to exhibit the same kind of symmetrical patterns as Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, and when such patterns fail to make their appearance they react by saying, well, this is simply not music at all. 6. For this reason I believe that, if I may give you some advice to make our discussions here easier to understand, something that of course matters as much to me as it does to you, that advice would be not to come to these lectures with those expectations, or indeed with any fixed expectations of the kind you may have acquired from elsewhere in your philosophical studies. Instead you should try merely to give your attention to the matter in hand, and to what I shall try to tell you about it as well or as badly as I am able. You should try and follow the argument and spontaneously think along with it, instead of being constantly on the lookout for nuggets that can be conveniently picked up. If you do that, I think I can promise you that there will be enough to satisfy you by way of subject matter, for I have no wish to underestimate, or to disparage, the hunger for information. It is the case rather that in intellectual matters, as well as elsewhere, the purely material elements, in other words, the raw data of thought before they have been thought about, have what might be called a certain vitamin content which stimulates the brain. And the need for this stimulation is not without considerable justification. But the compromise I seek is one which, see Parvulus et Companier Magnus 7, was chosen by Kant himself. For in his lectures Kant never attempted to teach his own philosophy directly, but always did so in the context of traditional ideas, and in actual fact these were the ideas of the selfsame philosophy of Leibniz and Wolff that were the target of the critique in the title of The Critique of Pure Reason. I am using Kant in a similar fashion, namely as a vehicle, in order, on the one hand, to introduce you to the problems of moral philosophy by telling you about his problems and his way of tackling them, and, on the other hand, to lead you to go beyond Kant through my critical and other reflections on him. At all events, that is my intention in the first part of this course. And, as I believe I have already told you, what I wish to do in the latter part of the course is to discuss with you some at least of the burning topics in moral philosophy at the present time. If we now turn to Kant's moral philosophy, we find ourselves confronted by an astounding fact. This is that his approach is anchored in his theoretical philosophy, in the critique of pure reason. This has to do with Kant's own tendency to lean towards theoretical systems, that is to say, with his predilection for inferring more or less everything else that goes by the name of philosophy from certain basic premises, from certain fundamental insights of his so-called transcendental philosophy which are thought to be incapable of being overturned. This includes moral philosophy, which in his thought is grounded in a certain sense in cognition. To this extent there is a conflict between his approach and what I talked about briefly in our preliminary remarks. I said then that the distinguishing feature of the sphere of practice, that is to say, the sphere of action that is covered by moral philosophy, lies in the fact that it cannot be translated without remainder into the realm of theoretical reflection. Now this second aspect is indeed expressed by Kant, albeit indirectly, in a thesis which is astonishing, even paradoxical, for a thinker who insists so strongly on the primacy of reason. It is expressed in the thesis in which he actually credits moral philosophy with primacy over theoretical philosophy. This thesis states that the so-called supreme questions of metaphysics as a theoretical discipline, the questions that figure on traditional lists and include God, freedom and immortality, are really only relevant as questions of practice, while theoretical reason regards them with a certain detachment. 8. I can tell you at once, since I believe it is the key to an understanding of Kant's moral philosophy in general, that the factor that unifies Kant's theoretical and practical philosophy lies in the concept of reason itself. And I believe that you would be well advised to try and grasp this if you wish to gain an understanding of the conception of theory and practice at work in Kant's thought. Reason is the capacity for right, correct thought, the ability to form concepts correctly, the ability to make correct judgments and precise deductions, as it is called in traditional logic. All this is constitutive of both theory and practice in his philosophy. That this is true with regard to theory is evident, since reason so conceived is the authority that decides about theory, and Kant, without concerning himself too much about the matter in detail, endows it with the ability to reflect on itself and its own scope, and even to set limits to its own jurisdiction. On the other hand, however, this reason, which is always the same, is the same reason at work in every part of the Kantian philosophy, no matter how disparate these parts may be. The reason that we encounter there, the organ of reason that is sometimes called judgment and sometimes understanding, is simply the organ of correct thought and is always the same in Kant. Within the realm of practical reason that we are concerned with here, it enjoys a particular position of supremacy because practical actions, insofar as they are the object of moral reflection, are precisely the actions that arise solely from reason, and that are constituted entirely on the basis of the pure laws of reason, independently of any perceptions, of any empirical material, of anything that impinges on this reason from outside. 9. Moral conduct in this sense is conduct that is literally pure. The word pure has a very profound double meaning in Kant. On the one hand, pure means in accordance with reason, undistorted by any matter in any way connected with the senses. But also, because it is nothing but action purely in accordance with the laws of reason, it necessarily has the character of the formal and the abstract that, as you are all aware, has been the reproach that has constantly been leveled at Kantian ethics. This may enable you to understand why Kant, in whose thought the primacy of reason is as predominant as in any Enlightenment thinker, nevertheless insists on the primacy of practical philosophy. For practical philosophy is the philosophy that exists in pure conformity with reason, without the need for its laws to pay heed to any material that impinges on the knowing and acting subject from outside. Morally speaking, such material, and hence to the consequences of my acts, are a matter of indifference in Kant, as compared to their ability to satisfy the laws of reason. When I tell you that in Kant morality is grounded in the theory of knowledge in a very precise way, you will hear more about this in a moment, but that at the same time, morality has primacy even over reason's interest in knowledge, you will feel the full force of the Kantian dualism of which I have been trying to give you at least the flavor. We might characterize Kantian philosophy as a whole by saying that it is the mountain pass linking the motif of epistemological enlightenment with the attempt to salvage metaphysics, to recuperate metaphysical meaning, which is concentrated for him in the highest universalities not only of knowledge, but also of ideas and hence too of the laws of morality. This will perhaps clarify for you this peculiar oscillation in the relative status of theory and practice. We could no doubt attempt to explain it away somehow or other, perhaps by saying that the theory is the foundation, but that morality, as the loftier, human dimension, stood higher than knowledge, or something of the sort. But in general I find it more profitable to trail my code a little, when dealing with complex systems of thought, of which the Kantian system is surely an instance, to reveal the fissures they contain, to chart them and to try and understand their origins and their meaning, rather than to explain such fissures and conflicts away more or less elegantly in the interests of a superficial harmony. In this respect, too, I believe myself to be operating in the spirit of Kantian thought, since his starting point, particularly in moral philosophy, is the consciousness of necessary and unavoidable contradictions, namely the so-called antinomies. Now, the problem of moral philosophy in Kant generally, and this is the first point you must grasp, is the problem of freedom, the freedom of the will. What this means in the first instance, just so as not to give you any exaggerated ideas about the question, is no more than a form of behavior that is not ruled by the causality of nature. That this problem of freedom is the fundamental problem of moral philosophy will be perfectly clear to you But it is far less obvious how we should think about the definition of this freedom, the definition of causality and the relations between the two. But we shall say more about this once we have obtained an initial clarification of the simple concepts that are involved here. I have said that it is obvious that freedom is the problem of morality in Kant. Very simple and consequently very clear. I have used the word I, and I do so with something of the cavalier largesse that was also characteristic of Kant in the same context, since he too did not dwell over long on what was meant by the word I, but simply followed pre-philosophical usage. So it is obvious that I can only act freely if I am not blindly subject to causality in the sense that this book is. For when I drop it, it will fall on the table and perhaps even come unstuck, since it is rather old. It is only then that we can speak of something like moral action, of good and just, right or ethical action, or whatever other terms come to mind. For if I simply act in conformity with causality, I shall not actually be present as the agent that somehow has to make decisions about an action. And it will be obvious to you that all ideas of morality or ethical behavior must relate to an I that acts. I think that what I am saying here is simply to remind you of something that has even succeeded in establishing itself in the criminal law. For example, take the case of a person who is mentally disturbed and who then wreaks havoc of some kind or other, but only because he is acting under the compulsion of blind impulses that are independent of his reason, so that the idea of freedom becomes quite inapplicable. In such a case we say that this man cannot be held responsible for his actions. He is not responsible. This means that in a certain sense he stands outside the problem of good and evil. This problem of freedom is presented by Kant in an intensified form in the doctrine of the antinomies, more specifically, in the third antinomy. I may add that it actually makes its appearance in the fourth antinomy too, but if you take a closer look at the fourth antinomy you will find that it largely overlaps with the third. There is no essential difference between the two, so it makes sense to restrict oneself to the third antinomy when thinking about the antinomy of freedom and causality. After what I have said about the dual nature of Kantian philosophy, you will perhaps be in a position to think about Kant's doctrine of the antinomies, which we need to examine a little more closely, in a rather broader context, not quite so narrowly as it would appear to you by focusing directly on the text. The essence of this doctrine of the antinomies is that it represents a conflict between that Enlightenment spirit of critical rationalism which I had already mentioned and, on the other hand, the intention of salvaging metaphysics. Because both these impulses, Kant does not speak of them in so many words, but they are well developed in his philosophy, are equally powerful in reason, because they make themselves felt in equal measure in reason, the ambivalence they express leads to insoluble contradictions. You can find a very fine summary of this doctrine of the antinomies as a whole, a really elegant and simple formulation of the doctrine of the antinomies, in the Kant commentary of my old teacher Cornelius, and perhaps I may read you the few relevant sentences that will show you very lucidly just what is at stake. We are talking here about the section of the Critique of Pure Reason entitled Transcendental Dialectic, Book 2, Chapter 2, The Antinomy of Pure Reason. I shall now quote the passage from Cornelius: wherever a constituent of the world we experience shows itself to be determined by a series of conditions that we are unable to follow through to their endpoint, our thinking becomes entangled in an insoluble contradiction as soon as this series of conditions turns out to be one that exists in and for itself, and, we must add, one that has not been produced by our own consciousness. Since this, that is to say, the fact that we perceive the infinite series of causes in our problem as one that exists in and for itself inevitably happens given our ordinary view of the world which Kant calls transcendental realism, this world view is unable to discover any escape from the contradictions in which it finds itself entangled. 10. Now, you can easily convince yourself of this by reflecting that if your thinking is still at a pre-philosophical, pre-critical stage, you will conceive of causality not as a function of our reason, but as a tendency that actually belongs objectively to external objects. Hence you will find that you will trace the cause of a condition, and the cause of its cause, back to what might be regarded as the primary cause. This process goes on to infinity. This infinite regress leads then to the contradictions that Kant treats of in the theory of the antinomies. Kant entitles the entire doctrine of these contradictions in the Critique of Pure Reason the Transcendental Antithetic. This is the doctrine of the antitheses in which reason is said to become embroiled. We are speaking here of reason in its unphilosophical usage, that is to say, in the active postulation of an infinite that is itself the product merely of consciousness. Here is the relevant passage from Cornelius by way of further explanation. The antithetic this is contained in section 2 of the Antinomy of Pure Reason does not, therefore, deal with one-sided assertions. It treats only of the conflict of the doctrines of reason with one another and the causes of this conflict. The transcendental antithetic, and it is with this that we are concerned, is an enquiry into the antinomy, that is to say, the necessary contradictions of pure reason, its causes and outcome. If we do not merely put our reason in the service of the principles of the understanding, verstand, and apply it to the objects of experience, but venture to extend these principles, that is, the principles of the understanding, beyond the limits of experience, that is, the objects of experience, then we shall see the emergence of what he calls pseudo-rational, Vernunftlichen doctrines, which can neither hope for confirmation in experience, nor fear refutation by it. Each of them is not only in itself free from contradiction, but finds the conditions of its necessity in the very nature of reason, except that, unfortunately, the assertion of the opposite has, on its side, grounds that are just as valid and necessary. 11. Ladies and gentlemen, I should like to underline this motif of the necessary nature of the contradictions in which reason becomes entangled. Kant himself is not quite so unambiguous on this point. Even in the Critique of Pure Reason, there are very powerful motifs that cannot readily be reconciled with the idea that the contradictions in which reason becomes involved are necessary. For if this really were necessity in a strict sense, then the kind of resolution of the antinomies that Kant is attempting would not be possible, and nor would the fundamental line of thought that I have sketched to you. This second idea, that is to say, the idea that the contradictions can be cleared up, implies that for Kant the term dialectic, that is, the doctrine of necessary contradictions, or the doctrine of the contradictory nature of theorems in general, is a negative term, a word of abuse. For Kant dialectic is always, necessarily, something false. This is why elsewhere he refers to dialectic as the logic of illusion, Schein, 12, and embarks on the elimination of the antinomies. Of course, this entire line of thinking only gains its profundity from the necessity of the contradictions in which we become involved. That is to say, only when this contradiction is seen as necessary can we understand the actual problem of moral philosophy, the fundamental problem of moral philosophy, namely the problem of freedom or unfreedom as a genuine problem, that is to say, as something arising from the matter itself, and no mere deception that can easily be removed. Incidentally, this motif of the necessary nature of contradictions that Kant derives from reason and nature, but that he then fails to carry through rigorously in his treatment of contradictions, is one of the motifs, and I would say by no means the least trivial one, that forms the starting point for the concept of a philosophical dialectic. That is to say, the idea of a dialectic as a medium of thought and a way of discovering objective truth acquires a sufficient impetus only when reason necessarily falls into contradiction, and only when it makes advances in the course of resolving contradictions, instead of dismissing them once and for all as errors of logic. And this is why I would like to place such great emphasis on this point. It would be a fascinating task, incidentally, and a task that to the best of my knowledge, has not really been attempted, to follow up this peculiar duality of the Kantian dialectic as a concept that implies necessity, on the one hand, and a mere failure of thought, on the other, and to examine it in the context of a theory of philosophical dialectic. 13. I simply draw your attention here to this problem, which naturally we cannot yet deal with at this stage of the course. The method Kant chooses to use in this dialectic, this antithetic, is one he calls the skeptical method, and he thinks of this as standing in extreme contrast to skepticism as such. Kant justifies this by saying that the skeptical method, that is the doubt cast on mere dogmatic postulates and the merely dogmatic, unreflective use of concepts, aims at certainty. The relevant, very interesting, statement goes as follows: for the skeptical method aims at certainty. It seeks to discover the point of misunderstanding in the case of disputes which are sincerely and competently conducted by both sides, just as from the embarrassment of judges in cases of litigation wise legislators contrive to obtain instruction regarding the defects and ambiguities of their laws. 14. So you can see from this approach to moral philosophy that the entire point of view of Kantian philosophy is objective, and that the idea that transcendental philosophy is subjective is oversimplified. This is because, on the contrary, Kant's philosophy represents the attempt to salvage the objective validity of the highest and most important propositions by a reductio ad subjectum, by reduction to the subject. This fits in precisely with the general thrust of Kantian moral philosophy, since what that amounts to is the reduction to the purely subjective principle of reason in order simultaneously to salvage the absolute, unimpeachable objectivity of the moral law. This makes it possible to say that the supreme principle of morality, namely the categorical imperative, is in fact nothing other than subjective reason as an absolutely objectively valid thing. The extreme opposite of this is the skeptical approach, which denies the existence of any such objectively valid principle. And this distinction between the skeptical method and skepticism as a philosophy is enough to enable you to see something of Kant's moral position. Unlike the skeptics and the sophists, his concern with the subject and human beings is not a strategy to enable him to dispute the universal necessity and binding nature of moral laws, but precisely to reinstate them. His task, therefore, is to demonstrate that the explanation for the misunderstanding lies in a false use of reason. And when this explanation has been found, we then see something that really does remind us of the workings of a dialectical philosophy. For by demonstrating the negativity of thesis and antithesis, by discovering the nature of the misunderstanding, to put it in Kantian terms, by eliminating this misunderstanding, we gain access to the positive side, to the higher truth. In this case we gain access to the explanation for the contradiction in reason itself. This creates the possibility of eliminating that contradiction through the action of reason itself. You can see from this that although Kant declares himself to be no friend of dialectic in the critique of pure reason, in reality he makes a much more positive use of it, thanks to this skeptical method, than might have been expected from his own views on the matter. Having said this, next time we can proceed to a closer look at the third antinomy. Thank you. Lecture 4, May 16, 1963. Ladies and gentlemen, today I would like to go straight into a discussion of Kant's third antinomy. Since this is not exactly a simple text for me to present you with as a kind of foundation at a relatively early stage of the course, I must ask you to concentrate your mind somewhat, and to make the sort of effort that the Kantian text expects of us. Let me start by saying something about the method adopted by Kant in the doctrine of the antinomies in general. This method is that of the argumentatio e contrario, as the traditional rhetorical figure was called. What he does is to start with a thesis and antithesis that contradict each other and both of which are equally obvious or not, as the case may be, and to prove them by demonstrating the nonsense that their antitheses lead to. Thus both are proved negatively, by their opposites, by their contradictories. This procedure, that may appear to you at first to be rather perverse, this procedure is, like all so-called formal features of respectable philosophy, motivated by its content. It is motivated by the consideration mentioned by Kant at one point in the antithetic that the two theses cannot be proved positively because as propositions about infinity or about an infinite series they lead to something infinite about which no positive statement can be made. Infinite here is not used in a mathematical sense, but in the meaning it had in ordinary pre-mathematical human reason. Conversely, it is possible for Kant to show that their antithesis leads to nonsense, with the implication that the thesis that thus arises indirectly from this can be regarded as valid too. I should just note in passing that this conclusion that the proof of the invalidity of the counter thesis of an argument entails the truth of the original thesis is by no means all that compelling logically. But we shall have to return to this later on. I must also tell you, and this is something we must look at in detail, to clear away any preconceptions, that when Kant speaks of causality in the doctrine of antinomies, the concept of causality refers in the first instance, I think this is the easiest way to present it, simply to the concept of causality that operates in the natural sciences. I may remind you, or draw to your attention the fact, I cannot actually remind you, since we cannot deal with the matter here, that one of the peculiar features of the critique of pure reason is that the mathematical natural sciences are not deduced from anything, but are somehow presupposed, that is, their validity is presupposed. Kant then goes on to investigate the conditions of their validity, with the consequence that the scientific concept of causality is what counts, at least to start with. This is of lesser importance for the concept of causality than it is, initially at least, for the concept of freedom that is opposed to causality here and which in fact, if I may express myself unacademically, is a veritable can of worms. let us consider the concept of freedom, and I would ask you to hold on to this idea for the moment. We shall soon have to modify it, but you need to have a relatively simple, straightforward idea to work with. The difficult distinctions will come soon enough. This concept of freedom is merely defined negatively in the first instance, namely as an independence from the laws of nature in a series of successive conditions, as an independence from the rules governing such a series that Kant otherwise requires. Initially at least, a positive concept of freedom, freedom in the sense of an absolute power to create as it was called later on in German idealism, is not involved here, although you will find that in the case of one particular concept that surfaces very quickly at this point. The concept of spontaneity, the transition to such a positive concept of freedom very soon follows. I must tell you, incidentally, that this concept is one that causes particular difficulties in the passage in question because it is not directly applicable to the concept of spontaneity previously employed by Kant, which referred to the production of ideas by the subject 3, but we can ignore this for the time being. Here I should just like to draw your attention to one point before we look at Kant's treatment of the antinomy, so that you can gain something of an idea of the problems involved. For what I have promised you is to introduce you to the problems of moral philosophy, and this means that I shall not just tell you about this fundamental line of thought in Kant, and explain it as well as I can, but I should like to show you that behind these arguments, which may or may not strike you as persuasive, there are a number of conflicting motifs that are hard to grasp and are often incompatible with each other. I regard it as the prime task of philosophical understanding, and every such course of lectures must work towards philosophical understanding, to show you that, beneath the seemingly plausible and coherent propositions, lies a parallelogram of forces that can be thought of as standing in the same relation to any given teachings as the parallelogram of forces in physics stands to its product. This is why I should like to draw your attention here to the concept of a causality through freedom that Kant introduces as early as the doctrine of the antinomies. This concept, which stands on one side of the antinomy, really contradicts the principle of criticism, the general principle of rational critique, according to which causality is a category, that is to say, it is not an attribute of things in themselves, the sphere of the intelligible. Instead, this causality through freedom is conceived as a concept of causality that stands outside the realm of phenomena to which the concept of causality is generally assigned. To understand this, in other words, to understand how we arrive at this highly curious syncopation, this interweaving of the motifs of lawfulness and freedom, and to grasp what impels Kant in this direction, is not just the key to an understanding of the Kantian ethic, but also of the structure of Kantian philosophy as a whole. In all probability it is also the key to what we think of as ethical problems in general. For this interweaving of freedom and necessity and the resolution of the contradictions implicit in it is not just a problem of cognition, but the very real problem that confronts every philosophical account of so-called morality. All this by way of introduction. Probably the simplest way to proceed now is for me to read out to you Kant's own statement of the thesis and antithesis together with the proof that he then gives. I can then flesh out the individual statements with as much commentary as I think necessary for you to understand his line of thought. I shall set aside any question of criticism for the time being, and only when I have the impression that the ideas have been sufficiently clarified will we proceed to look at their problematic features. Here is the thesis of this so-called third conflict of the transcendental ideas and freedom and total determination are to be classed as ideas because to assert them goes beyond the limits of possible experience and into infinity, and so, thanks to the architecture of rational criticism, they belong among the ideas. Hence the title The Conflict of the Transcendental Ideas. The thesis goes as follows. Causality in accordance with the laws of nature is not the only causality from which the appearances of the world can one and all be derived. To explain these appearances, it is necessary to assume that there is also another causality, that of freedom, for I shall take the liberty of making one small point, one which may have occurred to you too on a careful reading of the thesis. This is that when introducing the concept of freedom the word necessary has been smuggled in, a term borrowed from the realm of causality. This indicates that the concept of causality in Kant has developed to the point where it is capable of different interpretations, and goes beyond the scientific causality which is what Kant is explicitly dealing with. On the other hand, we can see that it is a symptom of the impossibility of eradicating the contradiction we have been discussing. It is simply not possible for him to prove what he wishes to prove, or what he wishes to express, because what he wishes to prove, namely the principle of necessity, is in a sense already presupposed. This feature, incidentally, is very prevalent throughout Kant's philosophy, and since I have advised you to read the Critique of Practical Reason, and would be delighted if you were also to read the Critique of Pure Reason, this pointer will perhaps be of assistance to your understanding of those texts. The fact is that you will only do Kant justice if you stop believing that everything in him can be deduced from something else. In this respect he presents a sharp contrast to thinkers like Spinoza or Fichte. When it comes to the validity of particular concepts, the concept of what is given, das Gegebene, has in Kant a meaning that goes far beyond what is given to our senses. All sorts of things are assumed to be given and then neither deduced nor proved nor explained. You may well think that there is something crude or even primitive about this procedure when you compare it to the tremendous sophistication of Kant's immediate successors, above all idealist philosophers like Fichte and Hegel. But it contains something that is closely bound up with the very essence of Kantian philosophy, with a claim that goes to the heart of it. This essence is the fact that in Kant the subject has not yet become the principle that presumes to be able to deduce from within itself the totality of everything that exists, including everything spiritual. Instead, the content of Kantian philosophy, insofar as it has a negative content, lies precisely in the limits it sets to the absolute claims of the subject. These limits also imply a limit to what can be deduced from this philosophy, even though, on the other hand, it presents itself as a deductive system. To take this one step further, this curious tolerance of elements that cannot be deduced from elsewhere, either from other concepts or from any supreme axioms, is a particular feature of Kant's thought. Moreover, this remarkable method does not confine itself, as we might first suppose, to the so-called material of our knowledge, but extends to the very forms of our consciousness which, despite their derivative nature in Kant, have in a sense simply to be accepted, and to be respected. This has the consequence that he can speak of necessity, and necessity is one of the categories in his system, as if it is something given. I cannot provide the evidence for this here. To do so would take us too far away from our present concerns. But I would just like to draw your attention to the so-called deduction of the pure concepts of understanding in Kant, where you can find a series of statements that explicitly confirm the existence of these givens. 5. Moreover, he even treats as givens things that are actually not given, but are supposed to be pure functions, pure activity. Let us proceed now to the proof of the thesis e contrario. Therefore, let us assume the opposite, namely, that there is no other causality than that in accordance with laws of nature. This being so, everything which takes place presupposes a preceding state upon which it inevitably follows according to Rule 6. Ladies and gentlemen, what you have in this sentence is the famous Kantian definition of causality, and you should note it as the succinct antithesis to the Kantian doctrine of freedom. In the sense in which it is discussed here, causality is the succession of states in accordance with rules. Therefore, this concept of causality is, as you will have noticed, extraordinarily broad, so broad that it is capable of the most divergent interpretations. You can even, though I leave this to the natural scientists among you, reflect on whether this concept of causality is so general that it even leaves room for the most recent criticism of causality in the natural sciences, namely in quantum mechanics. And you may consider whether the contradiction which is alleged to exist between Kant and modern science is not based on an over-narrow interpretation of the Kantian idea. But this is merely an aside for the benefit of those who have a particular interest in the concept of causality. Kant continues, but the preceding state must itself be something which has taken place, having come to be in a time in which it previously was not. For if it had always existed, its consequence also would have always existed, and would not have only just arisen. 7. Kant's argument here is very ingenious, we might even call it over-ingenious, but it is certainly very rigorous. According to Kant, a preceding state from which the present state must follow causally, in accordance with the proposition that if a particular state has the form A, it must be followed by a state with the form B, must, therefore, be a state that has arisen from something prior. For if that were not the case, if it had existed from the very beginning, then the present phenomenon for whose existence it provides an explanation would itself have to be an original phenomenon that had always existed. In other words, it would have no need to be explained causally by that prior state. that would obviously be unthinkable because it would mean the negation of the phenomenon as something existing hic et nunc, as a given in the here and now. Kant continues, the causality of the cause through which something takes place is itself, therefore, something that has taken place, which again presupposes, in accordance with the law of nature, a preceding state and its causality, and this in similar manner a still earlier state, and so on. 8. So, what we have here is the phenomenon that is familiar to all of you under the name of the causal chain. If, therefore, everything takes place solely in accordance with laws of nature, there will always be only a relative, subaltern and never a first beginning, and consequently no completeness of the series on the side of the causes that arise the one from the other. 9. The expression relative, subaltern, which has qualitative, judgmental overtones, just means secondary or derivative. According to Kant, then, there are nothing but secondary or derivative causes, which for their part, in terms of their own meaning, necessarily point back to a first, primary cause. He explains this as follows, and his explanation may not be entirely convincing, but the law of nature is just this, that nothing takes place without a cause sufficiently determined a priori. 10. What is meant here, and this is evidently the heart of the argument, is that, because it itself is in need of causal explanation, because it is therefore incomplete, this relative cause cannot be a sufficient cause itself, because it would only be a sufficient cause if, without constantly seeking out further underlying causes, it could be made so fundamental that any further questions about its origins would be meaningless. He says, then, but the law of nature is just this, and he believes he has established this in the doctrine of categories. 11. That nothing takes place without a cause sufficiently determined a priori. 12. In other words, without a complete determination of the causes. For otherwise the explanation of natural events would end in a vacuum, or the explanation of nature as a whole, as a necessity, which up to now Kant has simply taken as given in an unproblematic way, would be reduced to a mere chance. He goes on to say, the proposition is if no causality is possible save in accordance with laws of nature. He means, the proposition that no causality is possible save in accordance with laws of nature. The meaning is straightforward though the wording is slightly awkward, when taken in unlimited universality, is therefore self-contradictory. And this cannot, therefore, be regarded as the sole kind of causality. 13. That is to say, if I take this statement at its face value, its own requirement for a complete determination of causality necessarily remains unfulfilled, and it comes into contradiction with itself. And he now draws the conclusion from this, we must, then, assume a causality through which something takes place, the cause of which is not itself determined, in accordance with necessary laws, by another cause antecedent to it, that is to say, an absolute spontaneity of the cause, whereby a series of appearances, which proceeds in accordance with laws of nature, begins of itself. This is transcendental freedom, without which, and take note here that he is establishing transcendental freedom on the basis of the causality of nature, because otherwise it would be nonsensical even in the ordinary course of nature, and here he sums the whole thing up once again. The series of appearances on the side of the causes can never be complete. 14. What you see here, then, is the astonishing expansion of the concept of causality to embrace the idea of freedom, so that freedom too, is a causality sui generis. The best way to arrive at an understanding of this remarkable and surprising use of language is perhaps to reflect on the rather restrictive formulation that Kant has chosen here. He says that there is a series of appearances that can, as it were, start up of their own accord, without the need for any knowledge of the infinite conditions of natural causality. I think it would be as well to tell you what Kant had in mind here, since one of the principles of philosophical understanding is, and this is a rule that applies particularly to the later idealists, and especially Hegel, that we truly understand these apparently very formal arguments of the kind I have just given you only if we do not just follow the train of thought through to its logical consequences, but also succeed in imagining the real situation which underlies it and provides the model for it. Without a doubt, in this case the real situation is the individual's own experience, quite simply, the fact that I can experience for myself, whatever implications this may have within the framework of a universal determinism, that I have the ability to set series of causally linked events in motion through an action that, as Kant terms it, has an element of independence, whatever its objective connections may be with the causality of nature. Hence, If I once more pick up this unfortunate book, and drop it again, then the fact that it does fall is a matter of natural causality. It takes place in the macro realm, in accordance with the good old rules of cause and effect. But the fact that I take this decision, however foolish it may be, to lift this book up and drop it, the fact that I intervene, brings a further element, an independent one, into this causal chain. We might say that with this decision a new causal series is inaugurated. And how this series then becomes incorporated into the totality of causal conditions, that is something about which Kant would say, or rather it is wrong to say he would say it, because he does say in fact, this is a cura posterior, this belongs to a theory of human nature as far as its characters likewise form part of the empirical world. 15. But the immediate position for our own experience, the factor that stands out in opposition to the chain of causality is this initial act, the beginning of a second series of determinants which likewise for our own experience is not wholly determined empirically in its identity with, or its dependence upon, the universal chain of causes. 16. This is what Kant has in mind at this point, and he speaks of an absolute spontaneity of the cause without, however, defining the concept any further at this point. However, spontaneity here means something like an originating activity, independent activity for which no further conditioning factors can be positively given in the first instance. Indeed, in the critique of pure reason generally, spontaneity is the faculty concerned with the production of ideas, and so represents the productive faculty of consciousness and hence of the human mind as such. As you can read in the Transcendental Doctrine of Method, Kant is, like all respectable philosophers, no great friend of verbal definitions. 17. He introduces this concept initially in a fairly restricted sense, limiting it to the ideas. Because it is a matter of one of the fundamental motifs of subjectivity, and we might even say, the fundamental motif of subjectivity, he takes the liberty, rightly, of applying this activity of mind more broadly. 18. This is the argument Kant advances in opposition to universal causality and in favor of the causality born of freedom and hence also of the concept of freedom as the fundamental concept of ethics. The antithesis goes as follows: there is no freedom. Everything in the world takes place solely in accordance with laws of nature. 19. You can see here in the formulation of the antithesis that in defining causality in contrast to freedom, Kant explicitly equates it, as I have already indicated, with causality in nature. The proof goes as follows: assume that there is freedom in the transcendental sense, in other words, the freedom which emerges from the proof of the thesis is a special kind of causality in accordance with which the events in the world can have come about, namely a power of absolutely beginning a state, and therefore absolutely beginning a series of consequences of that state. It then follows that not only will a series have its absolute beginning in this spontaneity, but that the very determination of this spontaneity to originate the series, that is to say causality itself, will have an absolute beginning. 20. I should explain that on the premise that he is subjecting to criticism here, freedom in the transcendental sense is tantamount to being a category. In this it resembles causality. That is to say, freedom, and this includes action, the course of events independent of laws, would then become a basic category in accordance with which our knowledge and with it the phenomenal world is organized. If we now connect this to this explanation of the term transcendental, Kant's thinking is quite simply this: the categories, that is to say, the fundamental concepts, the basic furniture of my mind which I need if I am to be able to bring order at all into my experience, are nothing but the conditions that enable me to organize the world in accordance with laws and hence experience the world is governed by laws. Now if freedom, and this is the nervus probandi, is turned into a category, to a transcendental principle, a fundamental precondition of my knowledge of objects in general, this would mean that the opposite of conformity to law would itself be made into one of the categories, that it would therefore form the foundation of lawfulness as such, and that freedom would become the epitome of conformity to law, an evident nonsense. This is his basic thought. If you keep this in mind, you will, I think, have relatively little trouble in following the rest of the argument. We shall move on to the second stage soon enough. This means that if I were to accept the idea of freedom in its transcendental sense, freedom as category, then, Kant continues, this will lead to causality itself having an absolute beginning. There will be no antecedent through which this act, in taking place, is determined in accordance with fixed laws. 21. This would mean accepting a principle that would have nothing to do either with the knowledge in conformity with law or with any laws operating in nature. but every beginning of action presupposes a state of the not yet acting cause. And a dynamical beginning of the action, if it is also a first beginning, presupposes a state which has no causal connection with the preceding state of the cause, that is to say, in no wise follows from it. 22. Therefore, this conformity to law that according to Kant ought to follow from the principle of freedom, or that is to be introduced with the principle of freedom, would itself be in contradiction to the concept of conformity to law. Transcendental freedom thus stands opposed to the law of causality, and the kind of connection which it assumes as holding between the successive states of the active causes renders all unity of experience impossible. It is not to be met with in any experience, and is therefore an empty thought entity. 23. What he has in mind here is obviously the old idea of an ultimate, original creative principle as handed down by Aristotle and the scholastics. The ultimate root of this idea is the Aristotelian doctrine of the why, I, pa, I, why. The unmoved mover of all things. 24. That would be assumed and that would for its part fall outside the causal series in order to provide causality with a foundation. In consequence it would stand opposed to the principles of conformity to law. In this line of argument, then, the argument in support of the antithesis, Kant speaks as the consistent and rigorous man of the Enlightenment whose whole striving is to eradicate the last vestiges of scholastic, and ultimately Aristotelian and ontological, ideas from philosophy. And as a correlative to that, the argument in support of the thesis aims at the rehabilitation of the metaphysical principle. And when I told you last time that these two impulses are in permanent conflict with each other in Kant's thought, we can now see that this conflict has become thematic in the doctrine of the antinomies, that is, it is articulated literally in the relation between thesis and antithesis. Kant continues in the spirit of the Enlightenment principle, in nature alone, therefore, must we seek for the connection and order of cosmical events. Freedom, independence, and this is very interesting, and I would ask you to take careful note. It is something we shall have to discuss in greater detail next time. From the laws of nature is no doubt a liberation from compulsion, but also from the guidance of all rules. 25. In other words, the moment I wish to introduce the principle of freedom in a positive manner, and liberate myself from the compulsion that has been brought about by the system of categories of causality, and here we have Kant's underlying thought, nature would turn out to be a chaos, and it is against this that the entire thrust of the critique of pure reason is directed. For it is not permissible to say that the laws of freedom enter into the causality exhibited in the course of nature, and so take the place of natural laws. If freedom were determined in accordance with laws, it would not be freedom. It would simply be nature under another name. Nature and transcendental freedom, he formulates this in a very extreme way, differ as do conformity to law and lawlessness. Nature does indeed impose on the understanding the exacting task of always seeking the origin of events ever higher in the series of causes, their causality always being conditioned. In other words, they lead to further causes, but in compensation it holds out the promise of thoroughgoing unity of experience. In accordance with laws. The illusion of freedom, on the other hand, and here speaks Kant the determinist and champion of the Enlightenment, offers a point of rest to the inquiring understanding in the chain of causes, just as metaphysics holds out the promise that we can become conscious of the absolute and find in it a point of rest conducting it to an unconditioned causality which begins to act of itself. This causality is, however, blind, and blind, here, means that it does not form part of the framework of laws which govern knowledge and abrogates those rules through which alone a completely coherent experience is possible. 26. In other words, experience is entirely left in the hands of chance. I think that after these explanations, you will all have understood the argument, so that next time we can take a look at the difficulties lying beneath the surface of the text. Lecture 5, May 28, 1963. Ladies and gentlemen, I am still in the process of convalescing, but did not wish